the rarest, most threatened in the world. It's the great Indian bustard. It's a large bird. It breathes very slowly and it prefers dry landscapes. And the reason it's vanishing, it comes from a certain lack of human imagination. That is that pylon cables supposedly, put overhead rather than under the ground. The bird can't see, it hits, and it gets electrocuted and dies. And I thought I'd just start with that species, which is, right from here, which is just about 100 left right now as we speak, for Katherine's book, The Golden Mole, which is really a very powerful anthology of portraits of species right now vanishing. And she explores these creatures of how they enter human imagination, how they form it. And she explores them through myth, through poetry, even through politics. And there's also an equal exploration of the lack of human imagination, which is in protecting them and in imagining a multi-species world and of coexistence. So, Katherine, I thought I'd ask this work is very different from all your rest of your work, and how you sort of imagined and put it together. Yeah.
Thank you all so much for coming. It's such a joy to be here. So the book is very different from my other work. My academic work is in literature at Oxford, and much of my work is, in fact, children's fiction. But this is the book that I most loved writing. This is the book that has my heart. And the book came from this one idea, which is this. The greatest lie that humanity has ever told is that the world is ours and at our disposal to do with as we will. And it is a lie with the power to kill us all. It's a lie with the power to end the world itself. And I wanted to write something that would point out the astonishing breadth of intelligence, of beauty, of particularity of the living world. And so I started writing essays for the London Review of Books in about 2017-18 that were about animals. The only criteria for inclusion in the book is that the creature, swifts and giraffes and narwhals and crows, has to be a species or have a subspecies which is endangered, which, as I'm sure you all know, narrows it down almost not at all. There is almost no creature in the world that does not have a subspecies which has not been endangered by our heavy-handed moving through the world. But I also wanted it to be not just an account of the biological realities of these creatures. I also wanted it to be a book about the ways in which we have collided with the living world and interacted with the living world and the vivid mistakes that we have made. Like, for instance, 2,000 years ago, Pliny, the great philosopher, believed that the way that hedgehogs feed their young is by going into vineyards of grapes and rolling around in the grapes until they were coated on their spines, like sort of cocktail waiters from the 1970s, and then running home to their burrows or trees where they lived and feeding their young. And this is not true, but I wish very powerfully that it was. It's also an account of the ways that we have loved and cherished creatures, the way that we have lived alongside them. So it is not just doom. It is a way of thinking about the astonishment that we owe the living world and our failures in achieving that astonishment and how we might try to capture it, not just personally, but politically.
I want to jump on astonishment. And one thing which is there throughout is how creatures give us language, give us stories, just allow our mind to be vast. And there's mythology is from that. And so much genesis of mythology is from the living world and even, offshoots of it. And what is your idea of this sort of genesis of myth which you've explored so much?
Right, so a lot of the book has accounts of the way that we have talked about the way creatures came to be. often those are ways of explaining us to ourselves far more than they are ways of talking about the actual creature. One of the loveliest examples of this might be the story that was probably originated in 18th century China and is told in many parts of China, in also Tibet and Nepal, about how the panda got his markings. And the story goes like this, that once, long ago, pandas were pure white. And they used to gamble around the hills. And one day, a shepherdess was looking after her sheep, and there was a baby panda that believed itself to be a sheep. So it would go and hang out with the sheep every day. And one day a wolf came and went to eat the baby panda, and the shepherdess threw herself in front of the baby panda, saving its life but dying in the process. And the pandas came to her funeral. And as was the tradition, they covered their feet and hands in ashes to show their fealty to bravery. And as they wept, they covered their eyes so that they would not have to see her loss. And as they wept, they covered their ears so that they would not have to hear their own wailings. And those marks on the eyes and ears and feet are the panda's tribute to the truest form of love. And I love this. And of course, this tells us zero about pandas, but a great deal about the ways we want to teach children about what love might look like.
You explore this emotional vastness in a lot of these species, and you speak about how the human sense of ultimate, whatever, sentience, conscience, is upturned in your book. You know, I can think of a couple of species which actually grieve in this way. Hulock gibbons from the northeast of India. They sit around and grieve their dead, or elephants. And you've written about narwhal courtship, how seals rear their babies. And what about the stories you tell, you know, sort of evokes that emotional vastness? You say, oh, there's a species that are completely other, but equally and differently alive and conscious. Yeah.
This was the thing that I wanted so urgently. Like, if you took nothing else from the book, I would hope it would be this. We have so rarely underestimated the intelligence, or rather overestimated the intelligence of a creature. Almost always when we discover more about a living thing, it is infinitely more complex than we had previously believed. And that goes from elephants to the tiniest spider. There were spiders that we have taught to jump on command. There are spiders which are known to find watching documentaries of other spiders more interesting on the television than, say, Prime Minister's Question Time. There are astonishing records of, for instance, the way that matriarchal troops of lemurs have organized their social structures with a kind of nuance that is extraordinary. When lemurs feel a need to bond as a group, I'm sure so many of you will know this, they gather themselves in a ball, sometimes the size of a football, but sometimes the size of a bicycle wheel, a ball of lemurs known as a lemur ball, and they press their hearts against each other's beating hearts to feel each other's life. They also, lemurs are matriarchal society, and when the males become too aggressive, the females slap them. And one of the ways that mostly males contend is that they have a thing called stink fighting, where they secrete a stink gland, which they then wipe onto their tails and flick it at each other until one of them backs down, which, if you think of it, is not that different from at least British politics. And I just wanted to try to lay out. Another one would be, for instance, narwhals. You know, narwhals, you all are much more educated than my friends, I'm sure, but I have a friend who is a professor at my college in Oxford who admitted when I was telling about narwhals. Narwhals are, of course, those famous whales with the long unicorn-like tusk that grows up from the upper lip. It is, in fact, a tooth, an overgrown tooth, primarily found in the male, but in some rare females. And he admitted to me that he thought they were fictional. He had a PhD in philosophy. But for a long time, we believed that unicorns were real and we were unsure about giraffes in England. And so the thing about narwhals is you will have seen films, I'm sure, of their clashing tusks. And until very recently, we were unsure about the purpose of that clashing, and we're still not totally sure. It could be dueling. It could be a form of male domination. It could be, we have some filmed evidence of them using those horns to stun fish. So it could be a form of hunting. But also, those tusks have millions of nerve endings. And a dentist in Midwest America, he was also a professor at Harvard, discovered that it is likely that what they are in fact doing is rubbing together their horns to exchange information about the salinity of the ocean from which they have come. So from separate narwhal pods are exchanging information about the ocean through which they have swum. So not aggressors, but map makers. And these are things, I think, that are evidence that there is so much that we have yet to discover about the living world. The only question is if we will destroy it before we have time to discover it.
Wow, that's what a story that is. Yeah, I'm just reminded of the sperm whale as well here, where there's a finding that Franz de Waal talks about that it has more spindle neurons. The neurons for language is denser in sperm whales than human beings. We don't know what the hell they're speaking though. The lemur story is quite evocative. I was just wondering if we might read a bit. Yeah. You want? Yeah. Just there, the male female slapping the males, and
I will read this. Okay. Should I just read the bit about the ball, or about where's my slapping? Here we go. Okay, marvelous. I'm just going to read the opening of this bit. It is best not to take advice direct and unfiltered from the animal kingdom, but lemurs are, I think, the only exception. They live in matriarchal troops, as I said, with an alpha female at their head. And when they want to bond, they form their furry mass, known as a lemur ball, forming a black and white sphere that ranges in size from a plate to a wheel. They intertwine their tails and paws, and they press against one another's hearts. And to see it in some ways feels like an injunction of sorts, to find a lemur ball of one's own. The first lemur I ever met was a female, and she tried to bite me, which was fair because I was trying to touch her, but also because humans have done nothing to recommend themselves to lemurs. She was an Indri lemur, living in a wildlife sanctuary outside the capital of Madagascar, Antananarivo. And she had an infant, which was riding not on her front, as we imagine, but they ride on their backs, like a sort of miniature horse jockey. And she had wide eyes. The stare of this particular Indri lemur resembled that of a chemically enhanced young man at a nightclub who urgently wishes to tell you about his belief system. But her fur was the softest thing I have ever touched. I was just a child, and the limdri, which is the largest extant species of lemur, came up to my ribs as I was standing, so she's tall. And she looked, as lemurs do, a cross between a monkey, a cat, a rat, and a human. Can I read just the very end of this?
Sure.
Okay, so there's just this one bit. Okay, lemurs are fascinating because they only exist in Madagascar, and Richard Branson of Virgin is also trying to introduce them on his own little island, but we don't count him. Perhaps the most astonishing fact about lemurs is that they survived at all. Madagascar was part of Gondwanaland until 180 million years ago, and when the supercontinent began to split and the island began to drift eastward from Africa. But the first lemur-like fossils date from 62 million years ago, and they appear in mainland Africa. So how did the lemurs reach Madagascar? There are many theories, island hopping and land bridges among them, but the dominant theory currently is that the lemurs drifted to Madagascar on floating rafts of vegetation. And the island itself also kept drifting, and so when monkeys evolved enough to eradicate lemurs on mainland Africa with tremendously superior adaptiveness and aggression, somewhere between about 17 and 20 million years ago, Madagascar was out of reach by then. And I have seen many things that I've loved, but I don't think I'll live to see anything as fine as a raft of lemurs sailing across the sea towards what looked, until the arrival of humans, like safety.
Well, the Indian version of the lemur is the slender and the slow loris. So they live on our trees and they are nocturnal and they have trouble with monkeys too.
Have you seen one? Have you ever seen a
Yeah,
slow
yeah.
loris in the wild?
Yes, yes,
Extraordinary.
yes, yeah,
I am
yeah.
so jealous.
I've seen them crunching geckos.
Fabulous.
The lemur stories, among other stories, stands out for me because there is a sort of exploration, invocation of political learnings from other creatures. You've written about tunas and a direct insinuation of boundaries don't exist and they are mental constructs. And that's a sort of powerful thread of we can learn how to live together and there's timeless wisdom from other creatures. Might you speak about that?
Yes, I think it's a vision which perhaps lost fashionability in the 19th and 20th centuries during a sort of boom in technical industry. But the idea that we can learn from the living world is, I think, one that we lose at our peril. And, obviously the jokey things like lady lemurs, but also the ways in which creatures have moved, the forms of diplomacy that they engage in, and then I guess also the ways we have treated them are something that we should take into account when we reckon with what it is to be a human. So you have, at the furthest and loveliest end, the astonishing knowledge that we have built about the natural world. And people like you who dedicate their entire lives to protection. And there are these people. And I think that these are the people who we should be turning to more and more, who have spent their time learning about protection. But the other thing that the tuna teaches us, apart from the fact that they are astonishing in their swimming, I'm sure all of you know this, but up until I was a teenager, I did not realize that tunas are both absolutely astonishingly enormous, but also really remarkable because they are warm-blooded. And so they are able to go deep into the depths of the ocean where cold-blooded creatures cannot go. There's an amazing little bit that Hemingway wrote about, Hemingway and his sort of passion for the sea. In 1922, he wrote this piece about reeling in a bluefin tuna. And he writes this, it says, I won't do it in an American accent, although I am tempted. Actually, I am going to. If you land a big tuna after a 6-hour fight man against fish when your muscles are nauseated with the unceasing strain, and you finally bring him alongside the boat, you will be purified and be able to enter unabashed into the presence of the very elder gods, and they will make you welcome. So, this... Oh, that was terrible, don't applaud that. But this is a man who wanted to think of himself as fighting the sea. Like, this was a man who wanted to punch fish out of the sea. He wanted to think of his relationship with the sea as man conquering the sea. And the tuna is one of the creatures that has suffered most from our attitude of conquering the sea. Because bluefin tuna is delicious and incredibly rare, a single tuna can sell for £1 million if they're the right kind of wild bluefin tuna. They are victim to something called extinction gambling, which I'm sure some of you will know about. It's extinction speculation, where people are building stocks of things they expect to go extinct in the next 50 years and storing them in the expectation that when that moment comes, the value of their stocks will multiply 100-fold. So there are people storing tiger skins and bear organs and rhino horn. and there are huge stocks of wild Atlantic bluefin tuna being stored. The main owner of stored bluefin tuna is Mitsubishi, the same people who are making like your childhood cassette recorder. And it is driving poaching. So for instance, there was a study that found that with rhinos, this is a quote from an academic study, profit-maximizing individuals may have the incentive to subsidize, pay for, the slaughter of rhinos, including those with no horns, until the wild stock collapses. So people are actively trying to put rhinos into extinction in order to make their body of owned product more valuable more quickly. And I think that is something that we need to remember about ourselves. I am pro-human, but, you know, it is worth remembering that extinction is not just happening because of our laziness. It is incentive-driven in some places. And I think that we need to clamor more loudly, use our voices if we have them, use our money if we are lucky enough to have any, use our votes to fight against those who would act in such a way.
You know, that's a depressing story to sort of capitalize even extinction. But as if poaching wasn't enough or habitat loss wasn't enough, there is enormous dogmatism and unbased human fear which drives some of these creatures to existence. There's a book you find in India. It's called 400 Myths About Snakes, and it's all kinds of things made up. So there's this non-venomous snake called the bronzeback tree snake, very common. Non-venomous, doesn't even bite, but there's a myth that it'll bite you and come and watch your funeral. And you find it across India. And essentially there's a different kind of mythologizing at work there, and you explore that a lot. Would you have insights on that? Yeah.
I think it's difficult, isn't it? Often the first thing a myth does is endanger a creature. We have misplaced so many of our myths. You know, for instance, in England, people believe, polls amongst English people, when they are asked to estimate what percentage of spiders in England they think are poisonous, people come in at around 20 to 30%. And of course, the answer is less than 1%. And, you know, there is a chapter on spiders which points out that without spiders, we would have global famine, that we need to treasure spiders. I guess there is also the interesting thing that sometimes myths protect. For instance, where I grew up in Zimbabwe, the pangolin is said to create, so the alluvial gold, which is found in the earth in Zimbabwe, was said for a long time to be pangolin droppings. And we are taught that if a pangolin visits your home, it is the greatest gift that any god could offer you. And for a long time, that protected the pangolin. And the places where you find most pangolin poaching, as I'm sure you know, the pangolin is the most trafficked creature in the world. The myths that protected the pangolin were proof for a long time against that trafficking. The places where you find most poaching and most trafficking are where child poverty is at its most rife. And so often, the ways that you can, in fact, combat poaching and other forms of trafficking are to try to work with the people to whom the land truly belongs, to find ways for other forms of prosperity. Because, of course, as we also know, those who are actually killing the pangolins are getting a tiny percentage of the money that is actually being gained by those who are dealing them.
So, there's a kind of myth which protects and which adds sacrality, and there's the other kind. And of the first kind is also Katherine's book, Impossible Creatures, which is now an international bestseller. And if I might just read one of the endorsements. There was Tolkien, there is Pullman, and now there's Katherine Rundell. So that's the kind of power this book has had. There's this very evocative story you share about your childhood in nature and how that feeds in still into your writing, and if you might share that with us. Yeah.
So people ask me a lot about growing up in Zimbabwe. We grew up there because my father worked for international development. And I get asked a lot about whether or not it affected the book. And I think the way in which it did was I was very lucky to have parents who believed in benevolent neglect. So we spent a huge amount of time alone, outside, in wild spaces. And that seems to me one of the most precious things you can give a child. And in different parts of the world, it is harder than in other parts. In Zimbabwe, it's still fairly easy. In central London, it's very difficult. I don't know how hard it is in Jaipur to give a child access to a wild space. What would you say?
I'm not from Jaipur, so I'm from Chennai, and in an urban space, what we do is we try to focus on vegetation and insects. They are everywhere. And then go on to things like birds and But I'm sure it's very much possible in Jaipur. Yeah.
And so we had just this huge luck of being able to come up against wild things. And I think my parents were probably lucky in that the culture at the time made that more normal. So although we did incredibly stupid things, I have broken many bones, they weren't blamed for it because it wasn't an outlier in the culture. And I think if it becomes an outlier stance in the culture, then they would have been personally more at risk of real condemnation when, for instance, we did things like, we used to go walking in the what would be the sort of bush area outside Harare, and we came across a skin of a baby grey-banded spitting cobra, and we were so excited, and we ran to pick it up, and it was alive. And when you're an adult, you check first, and when you're a child, you don't. And I think that's one of those things that you just have to make some peace with the fact that that might happen. And my parents made peace with it. And years later, years and years, when my brother had his first child, I said to my mother, was that easy? And she was like, don't be outrageous. It was the most difficult thing I've ever done in my life. But I am so grateful that she did it.
Could you maybe just add on there, and there's a lot of teachers and parents sitting here, and what could go into their vision to offer children? I think nature needs children, and children need nature. And what do you feel could be the way in which this could be
I mean, in a dream world, I go to a lot of schools and I speak to a lot of teachers. In a dream world, you would have time every day to have your daily animal, your daily insect, your daily plant. You would, every single day of the school year, set aside 5 minutes to say, today, this is the creature we are going to learn about. And you wouldn't just talk about, the bile duct and, the claw length. You would actually try to find cultural resonances that would make these creatures come alive. So I think if it was me, I would say, okay, children, today we're going to talk about the giraffe. And then we would have 4 minutes in which we would talk about the giraffe. And we would start with, the facts of the giraffe, the astonishing height, the fact that we do not fully know why the giraffe's neck is so long, the fact that a great deal of mating practices between giraffes, more than 50%, is homosexual. We don't yet understand why that is. The fact that there are some species of giraffe which, in the rain, in a symbiotic relationship, shelter small birds in their armpits. They keep away the ticks, and they shelter them from the weather. And then we might also talk about the history of the ways we've understood the giraffe. So, for instance, this is one of my favorite facts. We never fully understood how the giraffe came to be, but we were certain it wasn't just giraffe to giraffe. So in 903, we thought that probably it happened when a panther mates with a camel. And in the 13th century, the great Persian cosmographer Zakir I-Khwanzwini, which I always get wrong, said this. Okay, so a male hyena mates with a female Abyssinian camel, and if the young is male and then it mates with a wild cow, that will produce a giraffe. And if you think about it, that is vastly more stressful than seems realistic from an evolutionary point of view. But I love that we believed that. And then I think you would talk about the fact that in 1826, a giraffe walked into Paris. It was a gift from Muhammad Ali Pasha to King Charles X of France. And it was shipped, first of all, in the back of a camel as a baby, and then it walked much of the way. And it bent and ate rose petals from the king's hand. And Paris went giraffe mad. Almost all of the clothes of the day became giraffe colors. You could have giraffe, these were actual colors. You could paint your house. You could have giraffe romance, giraffe in love, heart of the giraffe. Women wore giraffe-colored dresses, and they made their hair into tall piles to resemble the giraffe's ossicones, its sort of horns. And so high were the piles of their hair, made with bear's fat and orange blossom pomade, that they had to sit on the floors of their carriages because their hairstyles were upwards of a foot high. Millions of thousands and thousands of Parisians, they visited this giraffe. And people were said to faint or scream when they saw the giraffe. And then what happened was we tire of everything, even miracles. And eventually people got tired of the giraffe and they ceased to visit it, and it ended up being moved to a further zoo and dying and being stuffed and taxidermied. But I think that is such a vivid reckoning of how, if we were not used to giraffes, we would feel about them. My reckoning is that we should still be doing that. We should still be wearing our hair in foot-long towers, because that is the only reasonable response to something so beautiful and so unlikely that has evolved into something so unlike anything else. You know, in the book Impossible Creatures, it's about mythical creatures, but they live in this sort of hidden island, but they don't believe that giraffes are true, because we didn't used to believe that giraffes are true, because they seem impossible.
That specific myth people, yeah. That myth about the hyena and the leopard and the whatever, people should have sat and thought about a lot, you know. Your last essay is about the human, and you tell a very powerful story, and it's interesting because there seems to be in every point in history people pointing these things out and saying we are going off the road, and then this failure after failure, but there is this sort of repetition of calling to action, and perhaps we could read that story of Sibylline books. Yeah.
Okay, so this is the chapter about humans, and it's a true story, very, very, very loosely told. So the Sibylline books really did exist. They're now lost. They were written in Greek in around 510 BC. And the tradition runs that a prophetess, a Sibyl, offered the last king of Rome a chance to buy 9 books containing all the hitherto unknown secrets of the world. And the story of how the purchasing went, the process of the buying of these 9 books, has been told by the Roman grammarian Aulus Gellius in Attic Nights in the year 177, by Origen of Alexandria a couple of hundred years later. It was very popular in the Victorian age. The brilliant late great Douglas Adams tells it in one of his stories. My parents used to tell it to me, and it goes like this. So, once there was a great and flourishing city, and it had feasts and hard work, and the citizenry one day encountered a woman who came to the city dressed in hard-worn clothes. And she had with her 9 books, which she said contained all the untold secrets of the world. And she would sell the 9 books for 1 large sack of gold. In the original telling, in Aulus Gellius, it just says an immense and exorbitant sum, so already a huge amount of money. And the city's people find this hilarious, and they say, don't be ridiculous, we're not going to do that. And she says, okay, very well, but first I will burn 3 of the books. And she burns them in the city square, and she goes away. And then she comes back a year later, and it's been a bad winter. So the citizens are a little bit more receptive to her coming. And she comes back, and they say, you know, how's the undiscovered secrets of the world selling going? And she says, fine. And she'll sell them the remaining 6 books, which is now 2/3 of all the world's secrets. But the price is higher, 2 sacks of gold. And the citizens who have good maths point out that this is outrageous profiteering, and they're not going to do it. And she says, okay, may I borrow a match? And she sets fire to 3 more of the books. And the year that follows is harder, and people suffer. And there are more deaths than the people can really deal with lightly. And so when she comes back, she has 3 books, and she says they can have them for 4 sacks of gold. And they say, obviously we're not going to do that, don't be ridiculous, but give us the books and we'll form like a think tank, and at some point in the unspecified future, we'll let you know if there's anything in them and maybe we'll give you something. And she says nothing, she just goes about gathering firewood. And she burns 2 more books. And she goes away with the smoke still in the air. And the woman comes back a year later, and it has been very hard, and the townspeople are waiting for her, and they say, okay, we've worked out the maths. It doubles every time. We have 8 sacks of gold. Give us the last book. And she says, the price is now 16 sacks of gold. And they say, we cannot afford that. You need to be realistic. And she says, I am nothing but realistic. And she starts building the fire. And the townspeople go away, and they fight and argue, and people fall out, and it's bad. But they come back with the 18 sacks of gold, and they give them to her just as she is putting the book on the flames, and they snatch it from her hands. And the old woman says nothing. She puts the sacks of gold in a cart, and she walks to the city gates, and they call after her, it better be worth it. And she says, of course it is worth it. It is beyond all gold. And then at the city gate, she turns and she says, you should have seen what was burned. And that is where we are. We are at the last book. And it is our job now, with everything we have, our fight is to keep it from the flames.
I really think Catherine's books are among the Sibylline books, and all of you should buy it. Yeah, yeah. And so let's have some questions, please. Lady there.
Can you hear me? Oh, yes. No. Hello. Thank you. You have the most extraordinary gift for communicating. And I have a request rather than a question, and it may already exist. But you talked earlier about doing a 4 or 5 minute video every day. I'm British too, as you can probably tell. And on Radio 4, we have this thing called Thought for the Day. I don't know if it happens on the BBC World Service. Would you please create Creature of the Day, which is you describing the creature that we should learn about every day, so we can play it in schools and all around the world?
It's a really wonderful idea. I will genuinely try to do that. It's a great idea.
Gentleman at the back.
Hi, Catherine. It's very nice to meet someone from Zimbabwe. Yeah, I'm myself a ranger in the Kruger National Park in South Africa. So it's like you're from my hometown. And in India, it's always wonderful to have someone from the hometown. And secondly is you were just checking about what is the wildlife or the exposure to kids in Jaipur city. So actually, Jaipur is known as the leopard capital of the world. And we have got a population of around 300 plus leopards in and around Jaipur. So maybe you could visit one of the reserves, which is the Jalana Reserve, where I'm working on the human-leopard coexistence. And my question to you is, have you read the myths and the stories that exist in the Indian mythology? Because we have tons of stories, and also we worship all the animals. So it's like the African bush, every tribe is given an animal to worship for conservation. Have you come through any of these things?
I have. I am very lucky that my 2 best friends are both Indian, and so they have told me many, many of the astonishing myths that you guys have. And Ganesha is, of course, in the chapter about elephants. They are amazing stories. You must have grown up with superb stories.
There's a range of creatures here which are also Indian, from swifts to bears to elephants to pangolins to hermit crabs. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, I just really loved hearing you talk. And this might be a bit random, but I just wanted to like learn about your thoughts maybe on veganism and the controversy around it, because you can look at both sides and its potential benefits for the environment by reducing our impact on the animal kingdom, or does it, and the trends surrounding it, inadvertently contribute to new environmentally damaging industries like almond milk production and so on?
I think it's such a difficult question, isn't it? Especially as a global uptake of veganism is such a new enterprise that some of the outcomes are as yet unknown. My friends who work on veganism in an academic context, as in its probable outcomes, do tend to think that it will turn out to be overwhelmingly better than the other options, that probably it is the most ethical stance, but they know far more than me, so I'm only repeating what they say, but that it does seem at the moment. But then the book ends with an account of what we can do, and it doesn't say be a vegan, but it says, say you're a meat eater, maybe try to eat infinitely less meat. Say you fly, I flew to get here, try to fly infinitely less than you do. In England, there are people who fly from Scotland to England, and it says in the book, please treat that behavior like that of the malarially unhinged. That is mad behavior. So the book suggests both the really urgent actions we need to take, which are by and large systemic, political, global ones, and, all of the urgent personal ones which we know, which are buy less, consume less, try to think of a way to conjure up happiness, refigure joy that do not involve the relentless consuming of the world's resources, and try to be someone who participates in that new learning, I think.
Thank you. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes, gentlemen. Yeah.
Hi, Yuvan. Hi, Katherine. Wonderful talk. There's another interesting conflict I'm observing since last few years, which is coming in the news. And I personally also experienced that we talk about human and animal conflict most of the time. But there are animal to animal conflict, which is destroying even some of the very, very difficult or what you call it, almost extinct wildlife. I'm talking about stray dogs and conflict
So
with stray
if
dogs.
you can keep it short, we're almost out of time.
Okay,
Just, yeah.
stray dogs conflict with our wildlife right now. This is the major concern I'm feeling these days. Stray dog having a problem with the great Indian bustard. Stray dog having problem in Ladakh also with the wildcat, and even leopards are having problem with that.
So the problem of feral animals.
Yes,
Yeah.
it's a very difficult one, isn't it? And the way that we participate in those inequalities are almost always created by us and by the city structures that we have created. The question of stray dogs is one rather out of my remit. Do you know the answer?
I think there's a huge human component into introduction of species, invasion of habitats. That's perhaps all I could say. Could we have one more question? Just a minute more. One last question. One last question. From there. Yeah. Go on. Yeah. Last 1 minute. Yeah.
So your previous work had at its center a great man, and I'm just curious to know whose world you prefer to live in.
Although I love John Donne with all my heart, I love pangolins even more. Thank you all so much for coming, for being such a beautiful audience.